Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Are we about to see former WBO champion Joseph Parker take on faded Russian contender Alexander Ustinov? It's a good question. Parker's looking to return to the ring possibly sometime in late July or August, according to his promoters Duco Events. And we know Parker, he lost to Anthony Joshua back on March 31st. So the Ustinov fight, it is looking increasingly likely. And why is that? Well, the biggest indication that we've had so far that it could be a goer, there's a report out on a New Zealand website called stuff.co.nz. It floats that the 41-year-old Ustinov is a prospective opponent. It must be noted before I go any further, this same website has a rich history of being fed inside information on Joseph Parker, on what's happening behind the scenes with his camp. So what I'm going to do is I'll run through some of the statements made. And I'm going to say statements because even though it's presented as a news story, it's a news story in name only. There is no quotes in sight. And if anything, there's some revisionist history going on. And it's designed, in my view, to add credibility to Ustinov as a potential opponent. Try sell him to the New Zealand market. So I'll go through some of that and I'll work through the merits or otherwise of this fight in general. So this story from Stuff, it starts by saying, could the man who ended David Tua's career be lined up as Joseph Parker's comeback opponent? Duco Boxing are remaining tight-lipped on the Kiwi heavyweight boxer's next opponent. They say they have several options on the go, but are wary of getting into a public bidding war in a market where Parker's ability to go the distance with Joshua keeps the Kiwi on the dangerous list as fighters look to maneuver into mandatory positions. But Russian Alexander Ustinov is a name that is in the whispers as Parker plots his next move at what is a critical junction in his career following his first loss. Ustinov has appeal on several fronts. Duco won't pay a fortune as the reality of their new situation hits home. They also have intimated that Parker's next fight is likely to be in New Zealand as they struggle to find a slot for him in the busy British scene. Ustinov, who has a number 10 ranking with the WBA, would be a marketable fighter on the back of his one and only appearance in New Zealand when he beat Tua by a unanimous points decision in November 2013. Tua walked away from fighting on the back of that loss after struggling to counter the height and reach of the 2'2" Ustinov. Ustinov was touted as an opponent for Parker back in 2015 as the Kiwi camp came to the realization they needed to fight taller and bigger opponents given the size of the fighters ruling the division. He was touted as a possible opponent for Joshua last year, but blotted his chances with a unanimous points loss to Germany's Manuel Char for the WBA's third-ranked regular heavyweight title. Ustinov hasn't fought since that loss last November. Ustinov has showed a willingness to travel. He has fought extensively through Europe, he has appeared in the United States and of course New Zealand. His WBA ranking would be useful to Parker's rebuild. It's the one organisation that hasn't ranked the Kiwi since his loss. Okay, there is a lot to unpack there. But first, I'm going to lead off with this. I've got no doubt that the information for the stuff.co.nz story was fed directly from someone connected to Team Parker. No doubt about that. And much of the information, it's being spun in a way as to cast Ustinov in a very favourable light. It's essentially a sales pitch. It's designed to soften up the Joseph Parker fans and the New Zealand public more broadly to the prospect of Parker facing Alexander Ustinov. And if you read the story knowing only of Joseph Parker and not the broader weight heavyweight scene in the context that it sort of operates within, you would come off reading that article thinking Ustinov is still a major factor. Because after all, the story notes he ended David Tua's career, and the Tua being a household name in New Zealand, that takes you directly to the revenge angle. Parker might be able to avenge the loss, so on and so forth. That's automatically where you're taken. That's the opening line of the article. And it's clear if this fight is made, it's going to be a big part of how it will be marketed to the casual boxing fan who might buy the pay-per-view in New Zealand and potentially Australia. But I would just have to point out here, the narrative, it ignores a couple of crucial points. Story doesn't give both sides of what happened with the Tua situation. By the time that Tua fought Ustinov, he was over 40. He was a faded force. He'd been a professional boxer for about 20 years by that point. He'd lost his previous fight to Monty Barrett, and the Ustinov loss, it just reinforced that it was time for Tua to hang it up. He'd gotten too old to perform at the highest level. And the story notes that Duco doesn't want to pay a fortune and Ustinov might be willing to travel, etc. and so on. Question is, why is Ustinov potentially among the cheapest options to fight Joseph Parker? An affordable option? The answer? He's essentially all played out now as a top contender, and he's coming off a bad loss, a very bad loss to Manuel Charr. The reality is, and this is just facts here, Ustinov, 41 years old, relatively inactive in the last couple of years, coming off the worst performance of his career. He looked like a spent force against Manuel Charr. And none of that is explored or really acknowledged or covered in any depth in this Stuff article. I'll say it now. Joseph Parker versus Alexander Ustinov is a complete mismatch at this point in time. If Ustinov was 5 years younger, still in his prime, it'd be a very good fight. But that's not the case. The only thing going for Ustinov now, which effectively is what Duco is interested in, is the fact that he meets the two criteria that they've set wanting for Parker's next fight. Tall and ranked. Those are the boxes that he ticks. And you may have also noted as well in this Stuff piece, and this is where I get a little bit annoyed, or more than annoyed, actually a little bit pissed off. It mentioned that Ustinov was touted as a potential opponent back in 2015 for Parker, and that Ustinov was touted as a possible opponent for Anthony Joshua last year. But as the article said, it blotted his chances with a unanimous points loss to Germany's Manuel Charr for the WBA's third-ranked regular heavyweight title. I don't know what the third-ranked heavyweight title is, because such a thing does not exist. Super champion, regular title. But anyway, in terms of the Joshua comment first, this is the thing that actually annoyed me the most. By connecting Joshua's name to Ustinov's, and as recently as last year, it gives the appearance of further credibility in Ustinov as a viable, credible opponent for Parker. But here's where the revisionist history is at play. Either the website did a poor job researching this, or it was fed some misinformation and it's just eaten it up, not even fact-checked it. Because this assertion that Ustinov was touted as a possible future opponent for Anthony Joshua last year is way overblown. If you know the heavyweight division in any depth, you know that wasn't the case. And just to ram this point home, I did a custom search for 2017, pairing both fighters' names next to each other, and virtually nothing came up for the entire internet. The entire internet. There was one story that incorrectly characterized Ustinov as the WBA mandatory, and most of the rest basically mentioned that the winner of Ustinov v Charr would then have to fight Fresakendo, and then that person who won that fight might go on to fight Anthony Joshua. Lots of ifs, buts, and maybes. But I'm not done. Just to ram the point home a little bit further, it was not Manuel Charr's WBA regular title prior to November 2017, as the story indicates. It was a vacant belt, and it was only put up on the line very late in the piece, very late in the build-up. So Charr and Ustinov didn't even know that they were going to be fighting for the belt. And we know what happened. Ustinov lost, and he lost badly. And also, in respect, I'm not going to let this one go either, Ustinov being mentioned in 2015 for Joseph Parker as a potential opponent. Let's actually look at who Joseph Parker was facing in 2015. He was facing mid to high level journeymen. Jason Pettaway, Jakub Zaglan, Bowie Tupou, Carly Meehan, and Daniel Martz. So if Ustinov, if he was really being considered, it actually tells you something about where he was being considered in the scheme of the division by Duco. Just think about that for a second. And really quickly, just on the merits of the fight, it would shape as a pretty soft touch comeback fight. Parker could look good in, he could potentially get a knockout in, and it would be good for his confidence. And it would likely put him into the WBA rankings. And as noted earlier, the WBA is the only sanctioning body that he's not currently ranked in. And as I've already noted, it would no doubt be marketed as this whole Parker looking to avenge to his loss to the Russian. That would no doubt generate some interest among casual fans, even if in reality it's actually a bit of a stretch given how faded Alexander Ustinov actually is now. It's probably obvious that actually I'm not that thrilled about the prospect of this fight should it get made. But some of that has come about because of this ridiculous story that is essentially talking up Ustinov like he's an actual credible threat in the heavyweight division today. He is not. He is relatively inactive. He will present no real challenge to Joseph Parker. He's 41. He's a faded force that's barely in the conversation as a contender anymore. But, you know, okay, let's put him in the ring with a guy that just survived 12 rounds with Anthony Joshua. Whereas you consider Ustinov just got beaten by Manuel Char, who actually, you know, was verging on high-level journeyman status before that fight. The fact is, Ustinov is coming off that terrible loss, after which many of us were saying, actually, yeah, you actually performed horribly, you should be retiring. You got to factor that in. He's coming off a loss, and generally that would affect the marketability of a fight. Having two fighters who've just lost their previous fight, generally that doesn't make for such a good marketable fight. But apparently we've got this whole tour loss to fall back on. So, you know, I think there will be something weaved with this if this does get made. This whole avenge that loss, which in itself is a little bit silly. But with all this in mind, if Parker and Ustinov is made, it is a blatant cherry pick, wrapped up in a veneer of credibility. And it's based on what Ustinov used to be, not what he is anymore. And as I've noted before, Joseph Parker could now find it extremely tough to get meaningful fights for a while until he's in a situation where he's ordered to be in an eliminator or gets back into a mandatory position. And the situation is not ideal, but it just is what it is. So throwing out sort of, you know, Parker should fight White, Parker should fight Brazil, Parker should fight Miller, it's not realistic. That is pipe dream stuff. It's the heavyweight division. No one is going out of their way to do Joseph Parker any favors and advance Parker's prospects to the detriment of their own. Joseph Parker, Alexander Ustinov, it may be a mismatch, but it might be the best fight or one of the sort of on a similar level that he can get right now for the money they're willing to pay, and especially if they want it in New Zealand. Is what it is. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.